I don't really have much to say about Leia, Princess of Alderaan. I wasn't disappointed, and it was very enjoyable for what it was, but that was about it. I feel like this was the weakest of Claudia Gray's entries into the current canon. I think making Leia, Princess of Alderaan a young adult novel has done the book a disservice. The cliches about young adult romance and teen angst really detracted from the experience for me. It wasn't awful and didn't ruin the book by any means, but it would have been nice to see Leia as a 16-year-old without all the cliches, because let's face it, it's Princess Leia and there's nothing cliche about her. The story is okay, it's nothing spectacular, but it's not designed to be. It's meant to be a platform for Grey to explore Leia's growth from a teenager into a very young rebel, so I guess it serves its purpose. I think the book spent too much time going around different planets for the training exercises everyone had to do in the book, and if Grey had replaced those parts with more plot rather than interaction, the book would have benefited from it. I found Leia's romance with Keir Damadi to be mildly enjoyable, but overall completely pointless. Given the conclusion of the book, it just felt like the romance was there to fit the bill of being a young adult novel, whereas if she'd had a romance with him and Keir was still around after the book, that would have done something for me. If Leia had decided Keir wasn't the one for her, or the other way around, it would have shown signs of growth rather than being a victim of circumstance. It also would have allowed for another Alderaanian to be present post the original trilogy, and considering Chuck Wendig wrote about a group of Alderaanians trying to rebuild the Death Star so they could live in it, which still makes absolutely no sense to me, Keir Damadi could have easily been one of those survivors, and they could have had a mature relationship as adults, so just having them killed off rather than integrated into the lore just felt cheap rather than well done. For all we know, those Alderaanians disappeared or died after the events of the Aftermath trilogy, so that way she could still have had a lock of his hair in her keepsake box in Bloodline, but without him having a cheap death just because he's not in the original trilogy. It was nice to see Holdo as a teenager. I loved her character in this book because she reminded me of Luna Lovegood, and I'm a massive Harry Potter fan. I have all the deluxe editions, and when Order of the Phoenix came out, and my friend ruined the book for me when I was halfway through, I actually rammed his head into a door. Serves the twat right. So that quirkiness that Holdo had in the books is usually welcome with me. However, in this case, it wasn't. I understand that people grow up and mature. We even see a touch of it with Holdo in the book, but there's no way in hell a person changes from the Holdo we see in this book to the Holdo we see in The Last Jedi. There's just too much of a change in character there that even time, wisdom and maturity doesn't explain. To be honest, if the character of Holdo in the book had been renamed to a different character, I would have enjoyed the book a bit more. I enjoyed seeing Bail Organa a bit more stressed out in this book. Considering any movie we've ever seen him in, he grins like a fucking idiot. So it was nice for the character to gain a bit of character. I can understand why he's stressed out too. He's split between trying to do the right thing for the galaxy and protecting his planet, wife and daughter. It was nice to finally experience Bail Organa with a bit of emotion. Bria Organa, someone I don't think anyone has ever talked about except for the end of Revenge of the Sith. It was nice to see the female influence of a mother rather than just the influence of a father, which is all that's been shown to us even in the Ahsoka novel. She proves to be quite a strong character, and I enjoyed reading her parts, and I also enjoyed reading about the mystery of Leia's parents and the rebellion. On the one hand, it was pretty cool to see the rebellion forming and coming together as a properly functioning unit, while still trying to find their legs and their boundaries. On the other hand, the amount of bitching Leia does about how much attention she's not receiving from her parents is just irritating, and leads to a Hardy Boys investigation that's not really worth the trip. It just makes no sense to me that a 16-year-old girl wants more attention from her parents rather than enjoying herself now that she's been granted the freedom of an adult. As usual, Claudia Gray has done an excellent job referencing the lore from other books, the most notable of which being that we see her create her childhood memory box that we see in Gray's other Leia-centric book, Bloodline. Other lore makes appearances though, such as referencing Tarkin's time in training on Eriadu, seeing Captain Panaka as an Imperial governor, the Moa from Gray's first Star Wars novel, Lost Stars, and all the little references to The Last Jedi, which really was just too much to be honest. It's okay to reference stuff for what was at the time an upcoming movie, especially when it bears the Journey to the Last Jedi banner on its cover, something Disney haven't done very well so far, but it just felt like too much or too disjointed from what I saw in The Last Jedi. Then there's Crate. It makes sense for it to be here because, again, Leia Princess of Alderaan does have the Journey to the Last Jedi banner, and it does make sense when watching The Last Jedi because it explains how Leia knew about it. But I don't know, for some reason it just added up to too many references to The Last Jedi. I don't really think that was Claudia Gray's fault though, and I know I seem to say this every time I review one of her books, but the fact is, as writer and director of The Last Jedi, it was up to Rian Johnson what lore was introduced to the new Star Wars canon in The Last Jedi, and needless to say, he failed miserably. What did Rian Johnson really introduce? Canto Bight, which, let's be honest, could have easily been a small section of Cloud City. Crate, which, let's be honest, if you ask any Star Wars fan, is spelt wrong, and Holdo. I know a lot of people moan about fuel being a thing in the Star Wars universe, but to be fair to Johnson, and that's not something you'll hear me say often, Joe Schreiber did actually write about it in Red Harvest, so while it may not be a great addition to Star Wars lore, the fault doesn't lie squarely with Johnson on that one, unfortunately. So, out of the three main things Johnson introduced, Claudia Gray referenced two of them in this book. This is why I don't blame Claudia Gray, I blame Johnson. He barely introduced anything notable and didn't have a decent plot, so when another book bearing the Journey to the Last Jedi banner does reference stuff from the movie, like it's supposed to, reading it after seeing the abomination that was The Last Jedi just makes it clear how little Johnson did for the franchise with his film and gets tiring when reading said book. I think I mentioned in my Bloodline review how Johnson gave Claudia Gray advice on plot lines for that book, and I'd just like to amend what I said by adding that it made no sense for him to do that. The Last Jedi may as well have been set in a completely different universe, because nothing that was in Bloodline actually has anything to do with The Last Jedi, not even remotely. Collaboration is one thing, but when you steal other ideas as your own, then try to guide someone else when your projects are completely unrelated, just fuck off. You're unwanted, you're unneeded, and have nothing of value to add, and the whole world can see it. There are a few references to Rogue One, like Leia visiting Wobani and seeing Krennic buying ore to help build the Death Star, although he's only described by appearance and title, not by name. But you knew who it was supposed to be, just like you knew Leia nearly crossed paths with Han 3 years before A New Hope. I wasn't too keen on the bioengineering enhancements in the book. While I believe they could be a possibility in the Star Wars universe, I think it's pushing it too far towards generic science fiction. It's unnecessary in Star Wars and doesn't really add anything for me. I also don't understand why there's this thing where the Emperor is portraying himself as a youngish, healthy man, when we saw in Revenge of the Sith he used his scarred and deformed face to convince the Senate and the galaxy at large that the Jedi had attempted to assassinate him. So it's public knowledge that he looked that way 16 years before the events of this book, so it just makes no sense that now, 16 years later, he's pretending he's normal and young. I get when books don't line up with other books, it happens sometimes, But when a book doesn't line up with a film 12 years after its release date, there's no excuse. You could say it's propaganda if you want, but you can't unring a bell like the Emperor putting his scarred face out there for the entire galaxy to see. So that's not really a valid argument in my opinion. So like I said, there's not much to talk about with Leia, Princess of Alderaan. Technically, it ticks all the boxes, but it didn't really do much for me. Grey's writing was good, her prose, the way she keeps you turning the pages, and her lore references were also good, but overall the whole book just felt a bit meh. I think the book deserved to be a full adult novel because it defines the moment when Leia became a rebel, which outside of the movies may be the most important bit of lore of all. Instead of getting a novel that respects that, we got a novel more about teenage angst and romance, which I feel cheapens the importance of what actually happened in the book. So overall, I would say read it because it's worth it just to see Leia's journey, but be prepared for the forced romance and Leia's bitching about not getting enough attention from her parents.